In a world without World War I, the great empires of 1914 would have faced challenges, certainly, but nothing like the existential crises that destroyed them. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that complex multinational state ruled from Vienna, would have continued managing its diverse populations through a combination of bureaucratic efficiency and incremental reform. Yes, nationalist movements among Czechs, Serbs, Croats, and other groups would have agitated for greater autonomy, but the empire had proven adept at balancing competing interests for centuries. Without the war to tear it apart, Austria-Hungary might have evolved into something resembling a federation, granting more self-governance to its constituent nations while maintaining imperial unity. Franz Joseph's successors would have navigated these waters carefully, making concessions where necessary to prevent the empire from fragmenting. By our present day, we might see a European Union-like structure that evolved organically from the Habsburg domains, a peaceful economic and political union that never required the catastrophes of two world wars to create. The German Empire, under the Hohenzollern dynasty, would have flourished as Europe's industrial powerhouse. Already by 1914, Germany led the world in chemical production, electrical engineering, and scientific research. Without the war to derail it, German dominance in these fields would have accelerated. Universities in Berlin, Munich, and Heidelberg would have continued attracting the world's brightest minds without the exodus of Jewish intellectuals that Nazi persecution later caused. The German economy would have grown to dwarf even the United States, making Berlin the world's financial capital. The political culture would have gradually liberalized as the middle class expanded and demanded more representation. The Reichstag would have gained power at the expense of the Kaiser, culminating perhaps in a constitutional transformation that preserved the monarchy in ceremonial form while establishing genuine parliamentary democracy. Russia presents perhaps the most dramatic alternative. Without World War I to strain the Tsarist system beyond breaking point, the Romanov dynasty would have survived. The reforms begun after the 1905 revolution would have continued, slowly modernizing the empire's political and economic structures. The Duma would have gained real legislative power. Land reform would have proceeded gradually, addressing peasant grievances without the violent upheaval of Bolshevik revolution. Most importantly, there would be no Soviet Union, no Gulag system, no forced collectivization, no purges. The 70 million people who died under communist rule in the 20th century would have lived. Russia would have industrialized more slowly than it did under Stalin's brutal 5-year plans, but without the human cost. By today, Russia might be a constitutional monarchy, similar to Britain, with a Romanov figurehead and a democratically elected government. Its economic development would have followed a path more like Western Europe than the communist experiment. The Ottoman Empire also would have persisted, though perhaps in modified form. Already the sick man of Europe by 1914, the empire nonetheless controlled vast territories across the Middle East and North Africa.
Perhaps nowhere would the absence of World War I have more profound effects than in the Middle East. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which carved up Ottoman territories between Britain and France, would never have occurred. There would be no arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers, no artificial states created to serve European interests. The nations we know today, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, might not exist at all. Instead, the region would have evolved organically from within Ottoman structures or through local independence movements. Without European mandates imposed after the war, Arab nationalism would have developed differently, perhaps more gradually and less violently. The Ottoman Empire might have transformed itself into a federation of autonomous regions, similar to what reformers within the empire had proposed. Turkish, Arab, and Kurdish populations would have negotiated power-sharing arrangements without the trauma of imperial collapse and external interference. The Jewish-Arab conflict over Palestine would have taken an entirely different form.
Without the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain promised support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine as a wartime measure, Zionist settlement would have proceeded more slowly and through negotiation with Ottoman authorities rather than British colonial administration. This doesn't mean there would be no conflict. Jewish immigration and Arab nationalism were both real forces, but the conflict wouldn't have the same intensity or the backing of great power politics. Perhaps most significantly, there would be no artificial state of Iraq cobbling together Kurdish, Sunni, and Shia populations with little historical unity. No Syria and Lebanon separated to serve French interests. No Transjordan created as a consolation prize for Hashemite allies. The ethnic and sectarian conflicts that have plagued the region for a century would either not exist or would have been resolved through internal political processes rather than frozen by colonial borders. The discovery of oil would still have transformed the region's importance, but without European colonial control, the wealth would have flowed differently. Local rulers and populations would have retained more control over resources. The Ottoman Empire, even in reformed state, would have been the primary negotiating partner for oil companies. This might have led to earlier development of indigenous industrial capacity rather than the dependent relationship that characterized much of the 20th century. Saudi Arabia as we know it might not exist. The House of Saud's conquest of the Arabian Peninsula was facilitated by Ottoman collapse and British support. Without these factors, the Hashemites or other families might have dominated the peninsula, or it might have remained divided among multiple emirates and tribal confederations. The modern Middle East's map would be unrecognizable to us. Iran would have developed without the Anglo-Russian competition that interfered in its affairs throughout the war and after. The Qajar dynasty might have been replaced by reformers, but perhaps through peaceful transition rather than the upheaval that brought the Pahlavis to power. Turkish nationalism wouldn't have taken its aggressive form under Ataturk, since there would be no Allied occupation of Anatolia to resist.
The absence of World War I would have dramatically altered the trajectory of technological development. War is a powerful accelerator of innovation, and the Great War spurred advances in aviation, chemistry, medicine, communications, and manufacturing that might have taken decades longer to develop in peacetime. On the other hand, it also directed resources toward destruction rather than construction, and killed countless potential inventors before they could make their contributions. Aviation provides a clear example. In 1914, airplanes were fragile contraptions barely capable of sustained flight. By 1918, they were sophisticated machines adapted for reconnaissance, bombing, and aerial combat. The war compressed decades of development into 4 years. Without this pressure, aviation would have advanced more slowly, but along more peaceful lines. We might have seen earlier development of passenger aviation and airmail services, with less emphasis on military applications. The jet engine, developed partly in response to World War II military needs, might not exist yet, meaning we could still be in an age of propeller-driven aircraft. However, this slower development might have resulted in safer, more thoroughly tested designs with fewer catastrophic failures. Chemical industry advances present a darker picture. The development of poison gas during World War I also led to advances in industrial chemistry that enabled fertilizer production, feeding billions. Without the war's impetus, these developments would have come more slowly, but perhaps without the toxic legacy. The chemists who created chlorine gas, phosgene, and mustard gas would have applied their talents to peaceful applications. The petrochemical industry would have developed along different lines, perhaps more sustainably. Medical technology shows an interesting paradox. World War I led to major advances in trauma surgery, blood transfusion, prosthetics, and plastic surgery, all driven by the horrific injuries inflicted by modern weapons. Without the war, these fields would have advanced more slowly, but there would be far fewer people needing such treatments. The millions who died from infected wounds, gangrene, and surgical complications would have lived, but we might not have antibiotics until much later, since Alexander Fleming's work was partly motivated by wartime infections. The development of antibiotics might have been delayed by decades, though the peacetime study of infectious diseases would have continued.
Communications technology would have evolved differently. Radio was rapidly developed for military communications during the war, then adapted for civilian broadcasting afterward. Without military needs driving investment, radio might have developed more slowly as a commercial and entertainment medium. Television might have appeared earlier, since resources wouldn't have been diverted to war production. Computing would follow a completely different path. The Turing machine and early computers were developed partly in response to World War II cryptography and weapons calculations, which themselves grew from World War I's legacy. Without the wars, computers might not exist yet, or might have been developed for purely commercial and scientific purposes, perhaps delaying the digital revolution by several decades.
The economic implications of avoiding World War I are staggering. The war cost the major European powers between 60 and 80% of their national wealth. Britain went from the world's largest creditor nation to deeply indebted to the United States. France's industrial heartland was devastated. Germany was bankrupted by reparations. Russia's economy collapsed entirely under the strain. All of this destruction would simply not have occurred. Instead, the economic growth of the pre-war years would have continued compounding. The Belle Epoque prosperity that characterized the 2 decades before 1914 would have extended through the 20th century. Global trade, which had reached unprecedented levels by 1914 and wouldn't recover to similar levels until the 1970s, would have kept growing. The gold standard would have persisted, providing monetary stability that might have prevented the currency chaos of the interwar years. Europe would have remained the world's economic center far longer, possibly to this day. The industrial capacity that was turned toward weapons production would have produced consumer goods instead. Those millions of artillery shells were resources that could have become automobiles, appliances, and infrastructure. The opportunity cost of the war was incalculable, not just what was destroyed, but what was never built. Without wartime inflation and post-war economic chaos, the Great Depression might never have occurred or would have been far milder. The stock market crash of 1929 happened partly because of structural problems created by the war and its aftermath. Without these distortions, economic growth might have been more stable, if slower. The absence of a depression would mean no desperation that brought extremist parties to power, no Dust Bowl migration, no worldwide unemployment crisis. The United States would have remained an important but not dominant economy. Without the war to bankrupt Europe and boost American manufacturing, the American century might never have occurred. Instead, we might speak of a European century extending from 1814 to 2014. New York would be an important financial center, but not necessarily the world's primary one. London, Paris, and Berlin would have retained their positions as global capitals of finance and trade. The absence of war debt would have meant more resources for infrastructure investment. Europe's railways, already impressive in 1914, would have expanded into an integrated continental system decades before the current EU networks. Transatlantic shipping would have grown steadily, making international travel and commerce easier and cheaper. The middle class would have expanded across Europe as industrialization continued without interruption, creating mass markets for consumer goods. Without the war and depression to impoverish them, working-class families would have climbed the economic ladder more quickly. Labor unions would have grown in power through negotiation rather than confrontation, leading to earlier adoption of workplace safety rules, shorter working hours, and better pay. Social mobility would have been higher as education expanded and economic opportunities multiplied. The colonies would have remained sources of raw materials and markets for European manufactured goods, though independence movements would have grown stronger over time.
The cultural implications of a world without World War I might be the most profound and least quantifiable. The war didn't just kill millions, it killed optimism, faith in progress, and trust in authority. It created the modern sensibility of alienation, absurdity, and existential dread. Without the war, 20th century culture would have been almost unimaginably different. The artistic movements we associate with modernity, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Expressionism, were direct responses to the war's trauma. Without that trauma, art would have continued evolving from Impressionism and Post-Impressionism along more organic lines. We might have an entirely different aesthetic language, one not born from disillusionment and horror. Picasso's Guernica would never exist, but neither would the bombing of Guernica.
The lost generation of writers, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Dos Passos, would have written about different subjects entirely, if they wrote at all. Hemingway might have remained a journalist, covering peaceful events. The entire genre of war literature, from Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front to Sassoon's poetry, would be absent from our canon. Literature would have different concerns. The modernist break with Victorian conventions would have happened more gradually, driven by social change rather than by the sudden destruction of an entire world. Stream of consciousness technique might have developed anyway, but without the urgency of trying to capture consciousness fragmented by trauma. James Joyce might still have written Ulysses, but in a different cultural context, one where the stable world of 1914 had evolved rather than been destroyed. Poetry would have retained more connection to traditional forms. The radical break represented by T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland with its fragmented images and desolate vision came directly from war trauma. Without the war, poetry might have continued evolving from Romanticism through various schools without the violent rupture that modernism represented. We might have different laureates, different classics, different ways of understanding what poetry should do. Music would have followed different paths. Jazz still would have emerged from African American communities, but without the war to bring into Europe the American troops, its spread might have been slower. The angry, dissonant modernism of Stravinsky and Schoenberg was partly a response to the war's violence. Classical music might have remained more accessible, evolving from late Romanticism without the harsh break that atonality represented. Popular music would have developed differently too, with different influences and different cultural moments shaping its evolution. Cinema was still in its infancy in 1914, and the war shaped its development profoundly. Without the war to provide dramatic subject matter and to prove film's power as propaganda, movies might have remained simpler entertainments longer. The sophisticated narrative techniques of later silent films were partly developed to tell war stories. Without these pressures, cinema might have taken decades longer to develop as an art form, though it would have gotten there eventually. The great directors, from Eisenstein to Ford to Renoir, would have made different films about different subjects. Philosophy and intellectual life would have taken radically different directions. Existentialism, with its emphasis on meaninglessness and authentic choice in an absurd universe, was born from war trauma.
The United States would be almost unrecognizable without World War I's influence on its development. American entry into the war in 1917 marked the nation's emergence as a global power. But without the war, America might have remained a large but relatively isolated power focused on internal development and hemispheric affairs. The implications of this alternative path would reshape not just America, but the entire world order. Without the war to create demand for American food and manufactured goods, the U.S. economy would have grown more slowly. The boom years of 1915 to 1918, when American factories supplied the Allies, wouldn't have occurred. American farmers wouldn't have expanded production to feed Europe, avoiding the agricultural overproduction that contributed to the Dust Bowl. The United States would have remained a debtor nation longer, borrowing from European banks to finance its development rather than becoming the world's banker. Wall Street wouldn't have achieved its dominance so quickly. Politically, America would have remained more focused on domestic issues. Without the war to expand presidential power and federal authority, the limited government tradition might have persisted longer. The national security state that grew from World War I and expanded dramatically during World War II wouldn't exist. There would be no CIA, no massive military-industrial complex, no extensive overseas base structure. The Pentagon might not exist, and the Department of War would remain a modest bureaucracy overseeing a small professional army. American society would have remained more culturally isolated from Europe. Without the war to send millions of American soldiers overseas, fewer Americans would have experienced foreign cultures. The cosmopolitan influence that the war brought, American soldiers bringing back European tastes and ideas, wouldn't have occurred. American culture might have remained more provincial, but also more distinctly American, evolving its own traditions without as much European influence. The Great Migration of African Americans from south to north would have proceeded differently.
Without the war to create industrial labor shortages that drew black workers northward in huge numbers, this demographic shift might have been slower and less disruptive. This could mean slower progress on civil rights, as the political power black Americans gained by leaving the South was crucial to later civil rights achievements. However, it might also mean less racial violence in northern cities, where rapid migration created tensions. Women's roles would have changed more gradually. Without the war to draw women into factories and create labor shortages that proved women's capacity for industrial work, the suffrage movement might have taken longer to achieve voting rights. The cultural shift in women's roles that the 1920s represented was accelerated by war service. Without this catalyst, the flapper era might never have occurred, and women's liberation might have proceeded along more evolutionary lines. Prohibition might never have happened, as it was partly driven by wartime patriotism and anti-German sentiment. German Americans dominated the brewing industry. Without this impetus, the temperance movement might have failed to achieve constitutional change, sparing the country from the crime wave and government corruption that Prohibition created. Immigration patterns would have been completely different. The restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s were partly reactions to nativist sentiments stirred by the war. Without these restrictions, the United States would have accepted far more immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. One of World War I's most definitive impacts was the destruction of Europe's royal houses and aristocratic orders. In a world without the war, these institutions would have survived and evolved, maintaining power and influence far into the 20th century and possibly to the present day. The implications would reshape not just politics, but social structure, wealth distribution, and cultural values across the developed world. The Russian Romanovs would still rule, though in what capacity is open to question. By 1914, Russia was undergoing rapid industrialization and social change that would have demanded political accommodation. Without the war to discredit the Tsarist system utterly, reform would have continued. Nicholas II or his successors would have granted more power to the Duma, allowed greater press freedom, and gradually transformed the autocracy into a constitutional monarchy. The Russian aristocracy would have retained their estates and much of their wealth, adapting to new economic realities by investing in industry and finance. Today's Russia might have a Romanov monarch presiding over a parliamentary democracy, much as constitutional monarchies function across Europe. The British royal family would have maintained greater political and social power, without the wars to demand sacrifice from all classes and to make aristocratic privilege seem anachronistic. The House of Lords might have retained legislative power. The aristocracy would still own vast estates, and the class system would remain more rigid than in our timeline. Debutante balls, presentations at court, and rigid social hierarchies might persist to this day. Prime ministers would still require royal approval in more than name. The monarchy's wealth would be vastly greater, as the royal family wouldn't have been pressured to surrender as much property and income to appear relevant in an age of total war. The German Kaisers would have navigated the transformation of their empire into a more democratic system while retaining considerable influence. The Hohenzollern family would likely play a role similar to other European monarchies today, but with more prestige given Germany's economic power. The German aristocracy, the Junker class that dominated Prussia, would have adapted to industrial capitalism while maintaining their estates and social position. German society would be more hierarchical, with clearer class distinctions preserved. The Austro-Hungarian Habsburgs would preside over their multinational empire's gradual transformation into a federation. The aristocracy from across the empire's territories would form a cosmopolitan elite, educated in Vienna's universities and connected through marriage and business across ethnic lines. This elite would provide continuity even as nationalist movements gained autonomy for various peoples. The Habsburg court might remain one of Europe's most glittering, maintaining traditions of art patronage and cultural refinement. These surviving aristocracies would mean wealth concentration persisting longer in fewer hands. The social leveling that occurred during and after the World Wars, when death duties, inflation, and socialist governments broke up great estates, wouldn't happen.
Income inequality would be greater, but perhaps more accepted as natural rather than contested. The revolutionary impulse to overturn existing hierarchies would be weaker without the war's examples of incompetent leadership sending millions to death. Aristocratic culture would continue shaping tastes and values. Country house life, elaborate social seasons, and concern for lineage and greeting would remain central to elite culture rather than becoming historical curiosities.
Without World War I to weaken European powers and inspire colonized peoples with rhetoric about self-determination, the great colonial empires would have persisted far longer. The map of Africa and Asia would look radically different, with independence movements developing more slowly and following different paths. The implications for billions of people would be profound, touching everything from economic development to cultural identity to political freedoms. The British Empire would remain the world's dominant power well beyond the mid-20th century. India, the crown jewel, would not achieve independence in 1947. Instead, British rule would continue, perhaps evolving into a federal system granting more local autonomy while maintaining overall imperial control. The Indian National Congress would continue agitating for reforms, achieving gradual concessions. By our present day, India might have achieved dominion status similar to Canada or Australia, self-governing but still recognizing the British monarch and maintaining close ties to London. This would mean a very different India, possibly still divided by religion but without the trauma of partition, still economically tied to Britain, perhaps more industrially developed due to sustained British investment, but also possibly poorer due to continued resource extraction. Africa would remain almost entirely colonized. The British, French, Belgian, Portuguese, and Italian colonies would continue well into the 21st century. Without World War I to begin undermining European power, and without World War II to finish the job, African independence movements would lack the global context that aided them. The Pan-African Congresses and anti-colonial movements might exist, but they would face stronger, more confident colonial administrations. Apartheid in South Africa might be even more entrenched, or might never have developed in quite the same form without the particular post-war circumstances that created it. The African economic landscape would be vastly different. Rather than the post-colonial pattern of unstable states, military coups, and economic mismanagement that characterized many African nations after hurried independence, we might see slower development, but also more infrastructure investment as colonial powers maintained their holdings for profit. Railways, ports, and administrative systems built by colonizers would be better maintained. However, this would come at the cost of continued exploitation, with wealth flowing to European capitals. The cultural impact would be significant. African languages and traditions would be more suppressed, with longer periods of European cultural domination. Southeast Asia would tell a similar story. French Indochina would persist, meaning Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia would remain under French control. There would be no Vietnam War as we know it, though independence movements would certainly exist. The Dutch East Indies would remain under Netherlands control rather than becoming Indonesia. The Philippines, already under American control in 1914, might have received independence earlier or later, depending on how American domestic politics evolved without World War I's influence. The Middle East, as discussed earlier, would remain largely under Ottoman control or would be divided differently among European powers. Without the specific post-World War I mandates, the region would look completely different. The independence movements that succeeded in our timeline due to war-weakened colonial powers would face much stiffer resistance. China would have developed differently as well. Without the war to distract European powers from their spheres of influence in China, and without the Russian Revolution to create an alternative model, Chinese nationalism might have taken different forms. Imagine standing in the summer of 1914, watching as Europe teeters on the brink of catastrophe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo has just occurred, but in our alternative timeline, cooler heads prevail. Diplomats work through the night, compromises are reached, and the great powers step back from the abyss. The war that would have killed millions never begins. But what would this mean for humanity? The question isn't simply academic, it's about understanding how profoundly that single conflict reshaped everything we know. Without the First World War, the 20th century becomes almost unrecognizable, a parallel universe where technology, politics, culture, and human consciousness evolved along entirely different paths. The European empires that dominated the world in 1914 would have continued their rule, not collapsing in the fires of total war. The Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires might still exist today in some form, their monarchies adapting gradually to democratic pressures rather than being violently overthrown. The British and French empires would have maintained their global dominance far longer, perhaps even into our present day. Think about the implications. No Bolshevik revolution in Russia, no rise of fascism in Germany or Italy, no Holocaust, no Second World War. The cascade of horrors that defined the 20th century simply wouldn't have occurred. Instead, we'd be living in a world where the Belle Epoque optimism of the early 1900s continued, where faith in progress and reason wasn't shattered by mechanized slaughter. The economic prosperity of the pre-war years would have sustained itself, compounding over decades of peace. Industrial production would have grown steadily rather than being redirected toward weapons manufacturing. The young men who died in trenches would have lived full lives, contributing their talents to science, art, and commerce. Imagine the inventions never created because their inventors died at the Somme or Verdun. Consider the children never born, the families never formed, the demographic catastrophe of the war, with millions dead and millions more permanently disabled, would simply not exist. Europe's population would be substantially larger, younger, and more productive. Cities that were bombed or shelled would still stand in their original glory. The architectural heritage destroyed in the war would remain intact, from medieval cathedrals to Renaissance palaces. We must also consider the psychological impact, or rather the absence of trauma. An entire generation wouldn't bear the scars of trench warfare, poison gas, and industrial killing. The disillusionment and cynicism that characterized the post-war years would be replaced by continued faith in institutions and authority. This might sound positive, but it would also mean slower social change in some respects. The war accelerated women's suffrage, labor rights, and social reforms precisely because old certainties had been destroyed. Without that catalyst, traditional social hierarchies might have persisted longer. As we contemplate this alternative world without World War I, we must grapple with the ultimate question: would humanity be better off or worse? The answer is far more complex than it initially appears, forcing us to weigh different values and consider what constitutes genuine progress. This is not a simple calculation of lives saved versus technological advancement, but a profound inquiry into the nature of human development. On the most basic level, the absence of World War I would have saved at least 40 million lives. The 20 million dead in the war itself, plus the millions who died in the 1918 flu pandemic that spread so rapidly because of troop movements, plus the countless victims of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, plus the indirect casualties from famine and economic collapse. These people would have lived, loved, had children, created art, built businesses, made discoveries. The demographic impact alone would reshape the entire century. Beyond the immediate death toll, we must consider World War II, which was inextricably linked to the First War. Without the Treaty of Versailles to humiliate Germany, without the economic chaos of the interwar years, without the collapse of empires and the rise of extremist ideologies born from war trauma, the Second World War would not have occurred. This means 70 to 85 million more lives saved, including the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. The 20th century's death toll from war, revolution, and genocide would be perhaps 1/10 of what it actually was. This is the strongest argument for the alternative timeline. Hundreds of millions of people would have lived who actually died. Yet we must also consider that slower change might mean slower progress on human rights and social justice. The world wars, horrific as they were, accelerated the end of colonialism, advanced women's rights, broke down rigid class systems, and discredited racial theories of superiority. Would these changes have happened anyway, just more slowly? Probably, but we cannot be certain. A world of stable empires and persistent aristocracies might have resisted change more effectively than the traumatized, questioning societies that emerged from the wars. The technological question presents a genuine dilemma. We would have less destructive technology, nuclear weapons might not exist, but we would also have less beneficial technology. Many of the computing, material science, and medical advances we rely on today stemmed from military research. However, peace would have allowed more resources for basic research without immediate military applications. We might have different technologies, not necessarily fewer or worse ones, just different. Perhaps we would be more advanced in some fields and less in others. The balance is impossible to calculate definitively. Economistically, the absence of war would have meant sustained growth, compounding over decades. The destruction of 2 world wars and the Great Depression they contributed to represented an enormous loss of wealth and productivity. Without these setbacks, global GDP might be substantially higher today. However, this wealth would likely be distributed more unequally, with old elites retaining more power and newer groups having fewer opportunities. Which scenario is preferable depends on one's values, a richer but more unequal world or a poorer but more equal one. The question of national self-determination also demands consideration. In our timeline, the world wars destroyed multinational empires and led to dozens of new nations achieving independence. This self-determination came at enormous cost, but it fulfilled the aspirations of millions who sought to govern themselves. In the alternative timeline, these aspirations would remain largely unfulfilled, with most of humanity still living under imperial rule. Is peaceful subjugation preferable to violent liberation? Most would say no, that freedom is worth fighting for. Yet the specific fights of the 20th century killed so many that the question becomes genuinely difficult.